Last time we spoke about the Allied invasion of Borneo. The Allies initiated the invasion of Borneo commanded by General Morseed as part of the operation known as Operation Obu, aiming to reclaim vital oil fields from the demoralized Japanese forces. Despite their fierce resistance, American troops swiftly captured strategic locations on the island. The Japanese, already struggling with low morale and supply shortages, were unable to mount an effective defense. Amidst the intense fighting, Air Commodore Kobe's forces conducted air assaults on key targets, weakening Japanese positions further. As American troops landed on Tarakan Island on May the 1st, they faced heavy fire but managed to gain significant territory by nightfall. By early May, despite loss of ground, Japanese forces continued to resist fiercely. The emerging victory in Borneo marked a turning point in the Pacific Campaign and was ultimately foreshadowing the decline of the Japanese influence in the region, was paving the way for even further Allied advances. This episode is the Second Okinawa Offensive. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II. Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. If after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you consider checking out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a new episode covering the defense of the Great Wall of China in 1933. And over on Echoes of War, we're finishing up our multi-part series covering the Malayan campaign of World War II. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And the latest episode in the exclusive podcast series covers the government by assassination period for Japan, that being the 1920s to 1930s, where Japanese military officers were basically killing politicians and military officials left, right, and center. Last we left off, by April the 24th, General Ushijima's 32nd Army had chosen to abandon the first line of the Shuri defenses, with the exception of the extreme right in the Item Pocket area. However, the weary Japanese troops merely withdrew to the next line of prepared positions within the Shuri defensive zone, ready to make the Americans pay for every inch of territory they wanted to gain. Observing this, General Hodge promptly ordered the 7th, 27th, and 96th Divisions to regroup and enhance their positions through aggressive maneuvers, seizing strategic ground in front of them and pushing back the enemy outposts. His forces were also heavily depleted and exhausted, prompting him to plan a final offensive on April the 26th before rotating in the relatively fresh 77th Division and the 1st Marine Division for support. Unbeknownst to him, however, the 62nd Division had suffered significant losses, nearly losing half of its original strength on the left flank. In response, Ushijima decided to move the 24th Division and the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade north to reinforce the Shuri defense zone, establishing a fallback position for the retreating forces. This shift also meant that the southern areas were defended only by hastily assembled Shimajiri security forces of about 5,500 men, drawn from the rear area supply units tasked with delaying any American advances from the south until the main infantry units could return. The question of a second landing in southern Okinawa was considered by the 10th Army most seriously before April the 22nd. General Bruce, commander of the 77th Division, knew that his division would be committed in the Okinawa fighting as soon as Iwo Jima was secured. At Leyte, the amphibious landing of the 77th Division behind the Japanese line at Ormoc had been spectacularly successful. General Bruce and his staff wished to repeat the move on Okinawa, and they urged the 10th Army command even before the division sailed from Leyte. As Iwo Jima fighting drew to a close, General Bruce passed his recommendation to land his division on the southeast coast of Okinawa on the beaches just north of Minatoga. He believed that it would be necessary to effect a juncture with American forces then north of Shuri within 10 days if the venture was to be successful. His plan was either to drive inland on Iwa, a road and communication center on the southern end of the island, or to push north against Yonabaru. General Buckner rejected this idea, however. His assistant chief of staff, G4, stated that he could supply food but not ammunition for such a project at this time. The Minatoga beaches had been thoroughly considered in the planning for the initial landings and had been rejected because of the impossibility of furnishing adequate logistical support for even one division there. The reefs were dangerous, the beaches inadequate, and the area exposed to strong enemy counterattacks. Although beach outlets existed, they were commanded both by the escarpment to the west and by the plateau of the Chinian Peninsula. The 10th Army intelligence officers reported that the Japanese still had their reserve station in the south. Both the 24th Division and the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade were still in the area and could move quickly to oppose any such landings. Artillery positions on the heights overlooking the beaches were all fully manned. The 77th Division would be landing so far south that it would not have the support of the troops engaged to the north or the 24th Corps artillery. The steep terrain near the beaches favored the defense, and any unit there would be completely isolated. It might be more like the Anzio disaster than Ledi, Buckner suggested. Besides that, the 3 divisions on the line needed to be relieved, and Buckner's 3 unused divisions would all be needed there. On April the 25th, the main focus of action shifted to the Item Pocket, where Captain Bernard Ryan's Company F of the 165th Regiment surged forward following a 20-minute artillery bombardment to seize the summit of Ryan Ridge. Captain Ryan looked over the rugged expanse of Ryan Ridge, where the Japanese forces entrenched at the top presented a formidable challenge. They controlled the crucial territory between Ryan and the Fox Ridges, creating a dangerous stronghold that threatened his position. For Ryan, the solution lay in artillery fire. He understood that since the supporting fire would fall perpendicular to his attack route, the risk of overshooting or undershooting would be minimal, just a lateral deviation of 15 yards. With this confidence, he ordered a 20-minute artillery barrage on the slopes of the ridge. As dawn broke on the morning of the 25th, Ryan gathered his men from Company F, and he stressed the importance of a swift ground assault to capitalize on the artillery support. However, this was no easy task. His company was tired, undermanned, and severely low on food and ammunition. Despite these challenges, the 2 assault platoons sprang into action the moment the first shells began to fall. They charged forward, propelled by the roar of motors, machine guns, and anti-tank guns that kept the enemy forces at bay. But as they sprinted towards the ridge, the enemy struck back fiercely. Enemy fire and natural obstacles thinned their ranks, yet 31 determined soldiers reached the summit. They found themselves standing on a jagged ridge, strewn with rocks and scattered vegetation, a treacherous landscape that added to their struggle. Just as the artillery fire began to fade, the Japanese emerged from their hidden positions, those being spider holes, pillboxes, and tunnels. The Americans stood ready, and for the next 20 minutes a brutal fight erupted. They engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat, reminiscent of earlier battles on the Item Pocket ridge tops. The outcome was grim. 35 Japanese soldiers fell, and many more fled in panic. However, the Americans also paid a price. 5 men were killed and 2 were wounded. Now the real challenge began, consolidating their hard-won position. Captain Ryan knew that previous units had ascended these ridges only to be pushed back by the enemy. By the late afternoon, only 24 effective soldiers remained atop the ridge, with each man averaging a mere 6 rounds of rifle ammunition. Medical supplies had run dry, and all the aid men had become casualties themselves. Communication was severed, and Ryan could sense the tightening noose as the Japanese regrouped for another assault. Understanding the gravitas of the situation, Ryan devised a bold strategy. He arranged for Company I to maneuver around to his right flank, hoping to replicate the success of the morning. At 4:05 p.m., just 15 minutes after artillery support resumed, Ryan and his company made their ascent once more, enduring 5 additional casualties along the route. Unfortunately, Company I struggled to reach the top, cut off by heavy enemy fire on the slopes. In a moment of desperation, Ryan and his 2 men ventured out into the dark to seek reinforcement, a risky endeavor that could easily end in disaster. Although Company I was still bogged down, Captain Betts from Company K reorganized the urgency of the situation and quickly mobilized his men. By midnight, all of Company K had reached the ridge, bolstering Ryan's weary but determined troops. As these events unfolded at Ryan's Ridge, other companies from the 165th were locked in a brutal struggle at Gusukuma, located southwest of the ridge. Fierce fighting erupted as soldiers moved from wall to wall, tree to tree, fighting for every inch in the rubble of Gusukuma. Company A faced an unrelenting barrage, enduring fire from 8 machine guns and a 47mm anti-tank gun, much of which came from the yet untamed eastern slope of Ryan's Ridge. Amidst all this chaos, Private First Class Richard King from Company A became a beacon of valor. In a remarkable display of courage, he climbed a tree to eliminate a Japanese soldier perched above, and from his vantage point went on to kill 10 more enemies before nightfall. The day had been marked by sacrifice and bravery, with Captain Ryan and his men fighting heroically for every inch of ground gained on Ryan's Ridge. And as the sun set, they prepared for the challenge that lay ahead, their resolve unwavering amidst all of this turmoil. Meanwhile, other companies of the 165th Regiment engaged fiercely in assaults against Gusukuma, gradually gaining some ground but at high costs for both sides. At the same time, the 96th Division consolidated its position in front of Maeda and Koichi, while Colonel Poucher's 1st Battalion advanced 600 yards with minimal resistance to occupy the slope of Horseshoe Ridge. The following day, on April 26th, the general offensive resumed, with the bulk of the 165th Regiment continuing its costly advance into the heart of the item pocket, successfully clearing Gusukuma as Company F pushed along the crest of Ryan's Ridge towards the northern end of the Machinato airstrip. To the east, the 105th Regiment advanced to the southern edge of Nakama, while the 106th Regiment extended the front line towards Yafusu. Within the center, Colonel Halloran's 2nd Battalion launched an assault on the Maeda escarpment, but was quickly repulsed by a brutal barrage of Japanese fire across the front. However, elements of the 383rd Regiment managed to reach the crests of hills 150 and 152, securing a strategic position to inflict heavy casualties on the enemy below, as tanks and armored flamethrowers moved to the outskirts of Maeda to wreak havoc. At 4 p.m. in the afternoon, General Ushijima issued this order. The enemy with troops following tanks has been advancing into the southern and eastern sectors of Maeda since about 1 p.m. The 62nd Division will dispatch local units, attack the enemy advancing in the Maeda sector, and expect to repulse him decisively. Yet at the same time, adjacent, the 24th Division units were ordered to cooperate in this effort regardless of the divisional boundary. 2 hours later, the Japanese commanding general issued another order. The army will crush the enemy, which has broken through near Maeda. The 24th Division will put its main strength northeast of Shuri this evening. Lastly, Patcher's 1st Battalion attempted to advance along the western flank of Kochi Ridge, while the 2nd Battalion moved along the eastern flank. Both battalions were immediately repelled by a barrage of enemy fire. The following day, efforts to establish physical contact between the two units proved costly and futile. Meanwhile, Halloran's 1st Battalion, along with elements of the 383rd Regiment, maneuvered through the saddle between hills 150 and 152. They were receiving support from tanks and their armored flamethrowers. Although the tanks and infantry managed to penetrate into the southern edge of Maeda, the advance was halted by intense enemy fire. Atop the escarpment, an all-out effort was made to reduce a heavily fortified underground pillbox that separated companies F and G. However, this attempt also failed. Concurrently, as the 105th Regiment organized a defensive line at Nakama, Colonel Stebbins' 2nd Battalion engaged in fierce combat around Yafusu in an effort to straighten their front lines. Meanwhile, the disorganized 165th Regiment continued clearing the item pocket, which was finally declared secure, although many Japanese troops remained hidden in deep caves and tunnels. Due to this disorganization and the sluggish progress in securing the pocket, General Greiner ultimately decided to relieve Colonel Kelly of his command. The 165th Regiment would then be spending the remaining days of the month patrolling the Kulan Inlet south of the Machinito airfield. Greiner's overextended and battered division would not undertake any further offensive actions until being relieved at the end of April. At sea, a Japanese suicide boat successfully dropped a depth charge near the destroyer Hutchins, which had to withdraw due to some pretty severe damage. Additionally, Japanese aircraft re-emerged during the night with a kamikaze crashing into and sinking the ammunition ship Canada Victory, while other planes damaged 2 destroyers and a transport ship. Random factoid, just because of the name, the SS Canada Victory was amongst 531 Victory ships constructed during World War II as part of the Emergency Shipbuilding Program. Launched by the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation on January 12, 1944, she was completed on February 28 of 1944. The ship was designed as VC-2 SAP-3 by the United States Maritime Commission with hull number 93. Following her completion, the Maritime Commission transferred her to the civilian operator Alaska SS Company. This was merely a prelude to Admiral Ugauki's 4th Mass Kikusui attack, which launched 115 kamikaze on April 28th. While interceptor fighters destroyed most of these aircraft, 7 managed to slip past the combat air patrol and crashed into destroyers Dally and Twiggs, the destroyer Minesweeper Butler, the evacuation transport Pickney, and the hospital ship Comfort. Back over on the ground, Halloran's Company K attempted to weaken resistance at the escarpment by moving through the 27th Divisional Zone to the west and advancing southeast towards the apartment house barracks, where they were met with heavy losses and forced to retreat. Meanwhile, on the western side of Kochi Ridge, Patchler's 3rd Battalion relieved the 1st Battalion and launched an attack into the gap between the ridge and Zebra Hill. They successfully led Company K through Kochi and then into the cut, while Company L moved southwards along the western slope. However, upon reaching the cut, both companies were met with a barrage of machine gun fire, ultimately compelling them to withdraw. To the east, the 32nd Regiment faced delays in initiating their attack due to setbacks around Kochi, despite these successful raids by armored flamethrowers into the heart of Guangzhou. The following day, more kamikaze assaults inflicted additional damage on destroyers Hazelwood and Haggard. By the end of April, American pilots reported 1,216 air-to-air kills, while Japanese sources acknowledged losses exceeding about 1,000 aircraft, including 820 destroyed in the first 4 Kekusai attacks. This left Admiral Ugaki with approximately 370 operational aircraft for future operations. It's also important to note that the Japanese pilots inflicted significant casualties, resulting in Admiral Spruance's 5th Fleet suffering the loss of 1,853 sailors killed, with another 2,650 wounded, averaging 1.5 ships hit per day. As April ended, a concerned Nimitz personally visited Okinawa, where Buckner reminded Nimitz that it was a land battle. 10th Army operations fell under Army command. Nimitz responded, "Yes, but ground though it may be, I'm losing a ship and a half a day. So if this line isn't moving within 5 days, we'll get someone here to move it so we can all get out from under these stupid air attacks." Nevertheless, by May, the 10th Army had thoroughly bogged down into a costly, unimaginative frontal assault against the southern parts of Okinawa's heavily fortified Shuri line. Numerous 10th Army generals urged Buckner to play the amphibious card, that being to land the reserve 2nd Marine Division in southeastern Okinawa, behind the Japanese lines. Buckner ultimately refused, claiming insufficient logistics. Nimitz concurred with Buckner, at least publicly, but few others did. Spruance, Turner, Mitscher, they were all themselves growing increasingly bitter at the 10th Army's lack of progress, as well as the United States Air Force's lethargy constructing fighter airfields ashore that could finally relieve the battered carriers. Touring the developing Okinawa airstrips, a 5th Fleet staff officer discovered that General Hap Arnold had secretly been writing Okinawa's lead United States Air Force engineer, urging him to divert assigned fighter strip resources into building B-29 bomber airfields instead. A very pissed off Spruance went ashore to investigate and discovered the allegation was in fact true. Stunned, Spruance, quote, turned that situation around in about 15 minutes. On land following an unsuccessful tank assault towards Onaga, the 32nd Regiment intensified their pressure upon enemy positions to the southeast to support operations against Kochi Ridge. However, the 17th Regiment's attacks were still stalled. Meanwhile, after fending off 2 strong counterattacks that resulted in approximately 265 Japanese casualties, the 383rd Regiment advanced to capture the crest of Hill 318 in fierce close combat. This critical victory finally enabled American forces to direct fire onto Shuri itself. On April 29th, the 307th Regiment took over the Maeda Escarpment section of the line from the 381st, and the next morning the 306th Regiment relieved the 383rd over on the left flank of the 96th Division. Simultaneously, the 1st Marines relieved the 165th on the west coast, while the 5th Marines took over the line held by the 105th and 106th Regiments on May the 1st. Despite ongoing efforts, attacks against Kochi Ridge on April the 30th once again failed. However, the 1st Battalion of the 32nd Regiment successfully established Company C on Chimney Crag, and Company A on the Roulette Wheel, located on the ridge southwest of Guangzhou. During the night, large numbers of Japanese infiltrated behind these companies, disrupting the planned relief of the 32nd by the 184th. This relief intended to be completed before dawn on May the 1st and was delayed until the late afternoon. Despite this setback, Colonel Green's Company L managed to reach Gaja Ridge, positioned just in front of the conical hill during the night. Concurrently, Colonel Hampton's Company A attempted to mount ladders on the eastern end of Maeda's escarpment, but was quickly repelled by fierce defenders. On the western front, however, Company B successfully captured the edge of the escarpment using cargo nets by nightfall, although they were ultimately forced to withdraw due to heavy counterattacks later that night. Additionally, Hamilton's 3rd Battalion moved behind the escarpment to Nakama Village, launching an attack eastwards towards the apartment house barracks area. On the west coast, the 1st Marines had been attempting to advance south for about 2 days, but were repelled each time, suffering significant casualties in the process. However, they did succeed in clearing the enemy pocket at Miyaguzuku. On May the 2nd, the 5th Marines finally joined the offensive, but they encountered stubborn resistance, while the 1st Marines continued to struggle to cross the draw south of Nakanishi Village in an effort to reach the Chijaku Ridge Mass. Over to the east, Hamilton's Companies A and B positioned troops on the edge of the Maeda Escarpment, but made no significant gains due to the enemy's intense machine gun fire. The 17th Regiment eventually mopped up Onaga village, with the 1st Battalion taking control of the area, although they failed to capture Kochi during the renewed efforts. On May the 3rd, after a dawn artillery preparation, the 1st Battalion on the east and the 3rd Battalion on the west advanced in a coordinated attack, which included a movement by Company C against Hao Hill on the eastern flank of Kochi Ridge. However, this effort ultimately was thwarted as enemy heavy artillery and machine gun fire halted their progress. During May the 3rd, the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry, fought a desperate grenade battle to win the top of that part of the escarpment. The Japanese showered the top with grenades and knee mortars from the reverse slope and with 81mm mortar fire from a distance. Men came back across the narrow top of the escarpment to the north side, swearing and crying, saying that they would not go back up and fight. But as one platoon leader observed, yet, in 5 minutes' time, those men would go back here, tossing grenades as fast as they could pull the pins. Finally, while the 1st Marines made only limited gains as they pushed towards the Asa River, the 5th Marines successfully cleared the Awacha pocket and advanced between 300 and 600 yards into their zone. Unbeknownst to the Americans, their slow, incremental advances and the looming threat of the costly, protracted campaign were far from their only concerns. By the 29th, General Cho had argued that in the present state of affairs, the Americans definitely had the upper hand. If the status quo continued, the 32nd Army eventually would be wiped out. At this meeting, only Colonel Yahara spoke for continuing the war of attrition and avoiding an offensive. Yahara pointed out that in modern warfare, a superiority of 3-1 was usually needed for successful attacks. To take the offensive with inferior forces is reckless and would lead to certain defeat. Second, the high ground around Minami Ubaru had already fallen into American hands, giving them a major advantage in terms of defense. Third, Yahara argued a hasty offensive would fail, with thousands needlessly lost. Then the 32nd Army's reduced forces would be unable to hold Okinawa for a long period of time, and unable to delay the invasion of the home islands. A hasty attack would cause the 32nd Army to just fail its duty. And yet, the other young staff members were silent to these arguments. Cho then declared again that he hoped for an attack to snatch life from the midst of death. At this, Yahara left the room. All the other staff members then agreed to launch an offensive. Cho then tried to manage Yahara by sheer emotional force. At about dawn on April the 30th, he came to Yahara before Yahara had time to splash water on his face. Cho appeared at his quarters. Cho squeezed Yahara's hand and said with genuine enthusiasm that there had been nothing but trouble between them in the past, and that they would probably both die together on Okinawa. Cho then asked if Yahara, on this one occasion, would go along with the offensive. As Cho spoke, his tears fell abundantly. Yahara was deeply moved by this, despite his aloof reputation, and before long he was weeping too. He was overcome by Cho's sudden display of emotion and said, "I consent." And again, I want to mention the book that Yahara would write after the war, Battle of Okinawa. He talks about this moment amongst many others, and honestly, it's quite a good book. The only issue I take with it is Yahara was really trying to make himself look like a hero, that he had the right ideas and that people like Cho specifically did not have good ideas. And I mean, yes, in the circumstances, maybe he can make those arguments, but all their ideas were actually bad. But still, what's valuable about this book is Yahara gives the real Japanese perspective on one of the worst battles humans have ever faced. You get to hear what life was like in the caves and tunnels and all the abuses against the civilians, which is something not talked about so much. So yeah, just again, I highly recommend this book. Now, Cho's plan outlined that General Amamiya's 24th Division would lead the main effort on May the 4th, executing a two-pronged attack on the right half of the line. They intended to sweep past the Tanabura escarpment towards Minami-Oburu Hill, ultimately reaching the Futima-Atsutsa line. Meanwhile, General Suzuki's 44th Independent Mixed Brigade was to shift from its reserve position behind the 62nd Division to locate about northeast of Shuri, move northwest towards the coastal town of Oyama, effectively cutting off the 1st Marine Division's retreat. In conjunction with this, General Fujioka's battered 62nd Division would hold its position on the left flank and mount an offensive once the attacking units on its right breached the enemy lines. Additionally, the 23rd and 26th Shipping Engineer Regiments were tasked with conducting counter-landings in the American rear on the east and west coast, respectively. The Japanese reasoned their success depended on the extent to which they could support their frontline troops with artillery, tanks, supplies, and communications. Their plans specified in detail the role that each of the support units would play in the projected operations. Artillery units were ordered to regroup in preparation for the attack. Guns and howitzers were pulled out of the cave positions and set up further south in more open emplacements for greater flexibility. They were to open fire 30 minutes before the attack. When the infantry had driven through the American front lines, artillerymen were to move their weapons forward. The 27th Tank Regiment, heretofore uncommitted, was ordered to move from its position near Yonabaru during the night over several routes to support the attack in the Mada area. To support this comprehensive offensive, Ugaki was alerted to prepare for the 5th Mass Kikuzai attack directed against the enemy's naval forces. Once the plans were finalized and preparations were underway, Ushijima and Cho celebrated with a pre-victory banquet in their chambers at the headquarters. Even as Ushijima's banquet was underway, offensive operations had commenced. Japanese troops infiltrated behind American lines during the night, while the shipping engineers prepared for their counter-landings. The 26th and 23rd Shipping Engineer Regiments set out once to the west and east coasts. On the beaches south of Naha and Yonabaru, men of the Shipping Engineer Regiments piled into barges and assault boats. Also, small groups of soldiers with light machine guns infiltrated behind American lines on the night of the 3rd of May to attack Americans that became visible at dawn. Small units of 3 to 4 men, variously designated as reconnaissance raiding or rear harassing teams, proceeded towards the American lines to attack command posts, heavy weapons, communications, and depots to send back information by means of smoke signals. The 27th Tank Regiment rumbled up to Ishimi, several of its tanks being severely damaged by American artillery fire en route. Ugaki's 5th Kikusei attack began on the afternoon of May the 3rd when at least 19 kamikazes sortied from Formosa, stealthily approaching the American convoys. They successfully sank the destroyer Little and 1 landing craft, while severely damaging 2 destroyer mine layers and another landing craft. Additionally, Japanese aircraft targeted shore installations, focusing their efforts on the Yotan airfield. Within Nakagisuku Bay, a suicide boat further damaged a cargo ship. At around 2 a.m. on May the 4th, most of the boats from the 26th Shipping Engineer Regiment were spotted approaching the heavily defended area of Kuan. Armed with anti-tank guns, heavy machine guns, light arms, and thousands of satchel charges, several hundred men of the 26th Shipping Engineer Regiment headed over overcast skies for landing places below Yotan and the Kadena airfields. They miscalculated their position and turned into the shore at a point where it was very, very heavily defended. At around 2 a.m., riflemen of the 1st Marine Division on the seawall near Kuan caught sight of the 10 barges and opened up with concentrated fire. Naval flares lighted up the entire area. One company fired about 1,100 rounds from 60mm mortars. Several enemy barges were simply bursting into flames. One platoon of Marines used 50 boxes of ammunition and burned out 6 machine gun barrels as they sprayed the Japanese trying to cross the reef. Although many of the engineers managed to reach the shore, some fled back to the Japanese lines while others were trapped in Kuan, only to be mopped up by Marines at their leisure. A smaller group of Japanese forces advanced almost as far as Chatan, ultimately landing at Isa, where they were contained without much difficulty and destroyed the following day. The amphibious assault was even less successful on the east coast of Okinawa, as the 25th Shipping Engineer Regiment attempted to land near Oki. Most of these troops were killed by fire from the ships in Buckner Bay or by the 7th Divisional Reconnaissance Troop on land. As a result, the Japanese had suffered the losses of 500 to 800 men and nearly all of the landing craft during these honestly unnecessary and stupid amphibious assaults. At 5 a.m., Ugaki initiated his mass attack, launching 125 kamikaze and 103 escorting fighters from Kyushu to target Admiral Rawlings Task Force 57, which was currently striking the Miyako and Ishigaki airfields. Taking advantage of the weakened anti-aircraft defenses, the kamikazes managed to score some hits on the carriers Formidable and Indomitable, though both vessels ultimately would survive. They also targeted American shipping, successfully sinking destroyers Morrison and Luce, along with 3 landing craft. Additionally, they inflicted further damage on the light cruiser Birmingham and the escort carrier Sangamon, the destroyers Ingram, and 2 destroyer mine layers, resulting in a total of 589 sailors killed. On land, following a heavy artillery bombardment during the night, the 24th Division commenced its main assault. In the pitch darkness, Japanese troops made their way towards the American front lines. At about 5 a.m., 2 red flares ordered them to attack. As the artillery fire became heavy, a guard of Company A, 17th Infantry, on a hill just north of Onaga, dropped back below the crest for cover. He thought that the enemy would not attack through his own artillery, but the enemy did just that. A few Japanese appeared on the crest and set up a light machine gun. Private First Class Tillman Black, a barman, killed the gunner, and as more of the enemy came over the crest, he killed 4 Japanese who tried to man the machine gun. The enemy advanced over the crest in ragged groups, enabling Black to hold his own. Soon the whole company was in action and drove the enemy right off the crest. The Japanese abandoned 3 light machine guns, 4 mortars, and much ammunition. At another point, a surprise attack nearly succeeded. On some high ground about 1,000 yards east of Onaga, a group of Japanese crept up the hill in front of Company I, the 184th, commanded by Captain James Parker. In the sudden onslaught that followed, 2 heavy machine gun crews abandoned their positions. One of them left its weapon intact, and the Japanese promptly took it over and swung it around. Parker, watching the attack from the ridge, had anticipated the move. The Japanese managed to fire 1 burst, then Parker destroyed the usurped weapon with his remaining heavy machine gun. For an hour or 2 longer, the Japanese clung to the forward slopes, firing their rifles amid some shrill screams, but they made no further progress. By dawn, the general pattern of the Japanese attack on the east of the 14th Corps line was becoming clear. In the 184th sector, the enemy's 89th Regiment, following instructions to, quote, close in on the enemy by taking advantage of cover, had advanced around the eastern slopes of Conical Hill, crept across the flats, and assembled in force around the Y ridges east of Onaga. They had outflanked 3 companies of the 184th on Chimney Crag and the Roulette Wheel north of Kohazu. They also managed to evade the 4 battalions of the 17th around Kochi. Another Japanese element had attacked the 7th Division lines in the high grounds north of Unaha. At around dawn, 1st Lieutenant Richard McCracken, commanding Company A of the 184th, observed 2,000 Japanese soldiers in an open area east and north of Kohazu. They were perfect artillery meat. Unable to get through to his artillery support, McCracken called his battalion commander, Colonel Maybury, and described the lucrative targets. Maybury was equally pleased. McCracken suggested, however, that the colonel should not be too happy. A group of Japanese at that moment was within 100 yards of Maybury's observation post. There was indeed a party of Japanese busily unlimbering 2 75mm howitzers just below Maybury. But Company C of the 17th Infantry had spotted this activity, and within minutes maneuvered tanks into position and scattered the enemy group. Artillery eliminated the Japanese caught out in the open. A mortar duel ensued, sometimes at ranges of just 250 yards. The 3rd Battalion 32nd had also poured fire into the enemy area. This cut off the momentum of the attack, as a Japanese officer stood out in the open ground and waved his saber to assemble his men for another attack. American motormen waited for a worthwhile target to develop, then they put mortar fire back on it. 4 times this officer assembled a group, only to have his men killed or scattered before he was killed himself. While the 7th Division was repelling the Japanese attacks in the eastern sector of the 14th Corps line, the 77th Division was blunting the other enemy spearhead in the center. Here the Japanese 32nd Regiment, supported by some tanks and engineers, attacked behind intense artillery fire. This sector was the critical point of the attack, for a breakthrough here would enable the supporting 44th Independent Mixed Brigade to cut west and isolate the 1st Marine Division. Transportation difficulties beset the 32nd Regiment almost from the start. During the night, light tanks drove out of Shuri, up the Gunawan Road, but American artillery interdicted the road, preventing medium tanks from following. The mediums had to take a long detour, which was in such poor condition that only 2 of the tanks could actually enter the attack. Trucks and artillery were also slowed down. Even foot troops had trouble moving. When Japanese infantrymen recorded that his column was shelled on the way and that everyone except himself and 1 other were wounded. Another wrote of encountering, quote, terrific bombardments on the way to Kochi. These difficulties severely handicapped the 32nd Regiment in the ensuing operations. Supported by 9 light tanks, the 3rd Battalion led the assault of the 32nd Regiment against the 306th Infantry, 77th Division, before dawn on May the 4th. The enemy mounted his assault from southeast of Hill 187 and hit the 77th, where Route 5 curled around the east end of the Urusoimura Escarpment. The Japanese drove into the front lines of the 1st Battalion 306 near Maeda, shortly before daylight, when the Japanese infantry had failed to take its initial objectives east of Hill 187. Colonel Murikami, commanding the 27th Tank Regiment, became impatient and recklessly committed his own infantry company, a standard element of the Japanese Tank Regiment. American artillery fire destroyed 1 platoon, disrupting the attack, and daylight found the surviving troops in a precarious position across the American lines. Colonel Murikami ordered the company to withdraw, but artillery fire prevented a retreat during the day. When the Japanese used smoke for concealment, the Americans simply blanketed the obscured area with shell fire. The brutalized survivors struggled back to their front lines after nightfall. All the light tanks that had supported the attack were lost. By 7:30, the 306th Regiment had effectively repelled the enemy. The Japanese, broken into smaller groups, attempted to withdraw across terrain subjected to heavy artillery and motor fire, but few would make it through. By 8 a.m., the 89th Regiment had also been pushed beyond grenade range along the entire front of the 7th Division. Instead of retreating or pressing the assault, however, Kaneyama's troops made the critical mistake of milling about in the exposed flatlands, rendering them easy targets for American heavy weaponry. As a result, the 89th Regiment suffered severe losses from concentrated land, naval, and air bombardment, losing half of its strength. Colonel Yoshida's 22nd Regiment in the center fared no better. Its advance was delayed by the necessity of laying smoke, and it encountered significant hardships when the smoke unexpectedly cleared. Within the center of the line, the Japanese 22nd Regiment was never able to fulfill its role of following up the successful advance of flank units, and the regiment spent the entire day locked in a violent firefight with men of the 3rd Battalion of 306th, 3rd Battalion of the 17th, and 1st Battalion of the 17th Regiments holding the Kochi and Naga area. The Japanese reported the 22nd was not able to attain results worth mentioning. Unbeknownst to the Americans, elements of the 1st Battalion of the 22nd Regiment had penetrated more than 1,000 yards behind the American lines near Kochi, identifying a significant weak point before pulling back to the regimental line. Nevertheless, due to the overall failure of the 24th Division, the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade was not even committed to the attack. On the fronts at Maeda and the west coast, the American forces made some gains. Hamilton's 1st Battalion successfully executed a complex demolition assault on the extensive cave tunnel pillbox network located about 200 feet west of the eastern end of the escarpment, effectively repulsing several subsequent counterattacks and inflicting approximately 600 casualties on the Japanese. The 5th Marines also advanced about 400 yards through hotly contested terrain during the day. Although pinned down in the coastal area, Colonel Chappell's 1st Battalion managed to break through a defile east of Jikaku, while the 3rd Battalion secured a ridge approximately 400 yards ahead of its position. Despite the apparent failure of the Japanese attack, Amamiya refused to abandon the offensive, ordering a renewed effort during the night. Kitago's uncommitted 1st Battalion, along with the attached 26th Independent Battalion, was directed to penetrate the enemy lines northwest of Kochi in a night attack, aiming to replicate the breakthrough achieved by the elements of the 1st Battalion of the 22nd Regiment. Following another artillery bombardment, the Japanese launched their assault against the 306th Regiment about 2 a.m. on May the 5th. However, this attack was quickly disrupted by American artillery. 3 hours later, the Japanese struck again, this time supported by tanks. They pressed through artillery and motor fire to engage the 306 in close combat. Fierce firefights erupted along the regimental's entire line, resulting in the Japanese suffering 248 deaths during the fighting. Amidst this chaos, a significant portion of Kitago's 1st Battalion successfully infiltrated behind American lines, breaching the defenses at a point between Route 5 and Kochi. While approximately 90 of the infiltrators were quickly killed, while assaulting the command post of the 306th Regiment, around 450 Japanese troops did cross the divisional boundary and managed to reoccupy the town of Tanabaru, along with the Tanabaru escarpment, effectively cutting off the supply road for the 17th Regiment. In response, Patchler sent Company E to eliminate these infiltrators, but they underestimated the enemy's strength, and they were repelled with heavy losses. With Company E stalled on the eastern slopes of the escarpment, Company F, supported by tanks, attempted a broad flanking maneuver. They successfully pushed through Tanabaru, spending the day destroying the enemy's hastily established defenses there. Company E then took over the assault, and by nightfall, they had reached the top of the Tanabaru escarpment following a motor preparation. The relentless battle for the Tanabaru escarpment continued for the next 2 days, resulting in the Japanese losing 462 killed behind American lines. Only a few men managed to escape the Tanabaru death trap and return to the Shuri lines. Made even more desperate by the failure of Amamiya's grand attack, the ragtag battalions of the 62nd Division fought to the death to defend the vital western approaches to Shuri, ensuring that every yard gained came to a steep price for the Marine lives. Each pillbox, cave, and tomb became a stronghold that unleashed a torrent of fire against the attacking Marines from all directions. Despite the fierce resistance, Deval's units made significant progress on May the 5th. The 5th Marines advanced their lines by an average of 300 yards, while the 1st Marines seized the high ground along the Asia River. At the Meadian escarpment, the reverse slope was slowly captured as caves were blasted and sealed off. By midnight, it became clear to Ushijima that the counteroffensive had all but failed, with the Japanese suffering approximately 6,227 deaths and losing 59 artillery pieces. In turn, the 7th and 77th Divisions, which had absorbed the brunt of the enemy counterattack, sustained 714 losses. Despite these heavy casualties, the 1st Marine Division, which continued its push to the south, incurred corresponding losses of about 649 men. This indicated that the Americans experienced greater losses due to the Japanese defensive tactics of attrition than that counteroffensive. However, the morale of the 32nd Army had been shattered, as the Japanese abandoned all hope for a successful outcome from the operation. Nevertheless, the 24th Division and the 5th Artillery Command were ordered to reorganize and shift to a holding action. This strategy aimed to bleed the American strength by forcing the 10th Army to maintain its slow, deadly, yard-by-yard advance into fire of prepared positions. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released an episode covering the Japanese invasion of North China, the battle for the Great Wall of China in 1933. And on Echoes of War, we're finishing up our multi-part series covering the Malayan campaign of World War II. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. In the fierce and desperate Second Okinawa counteroffensive, weary American troops pressed into determined Japanese defenses. Captain Ryan's valor led to a hard-won victory, despite heavy casualties. As the chaos unfolded, Japanese morale waned, marking a turning point in the battle for Okinawa. The relentless battle showcased unparalleled sacrifice, foreshadowing the Allies' gradual victory in the Pacific.